As I said, Associate Professor, Art History and Media Studies at Stanford University. Lucky comic scholar who got a tenure-track position. Woo! Also author of a very important book, Matters of Gravity, Special Effects and Superheroes in the 20th Century. Scott and I went to a comics conference, a superhero conference rather, in Australia. And I found it interesting that he was sort of a big star because so many people had used his books that we were someplace and I saw a graduate student sort of freak out because she got to meet Scott Bukatman. So anyway, I'll just turn it over to him.
That was my sister. Thank you, Peter, for that very nice introduction. And I think that woman was related to me. I'm sure she was. But anyway, a couple of things. I want to thank Peter for inviting me to this event and allowing me to stick it to my art history department, that I'm one of the only members of our art department that comes to speak at the Metropolitan Museum. So I think that's good. And to Andrew for the event and all of this. I usually wouldn't wear the little superhero shirt, but there was a little notice that said, "People in costume will not be admitted," which I thought begged the whole question so much that I decided I would just go at least this far. But my last preamble comment is that two words that have come up so far have been functionalism and plausibility, and you'll hear no more about them in this talk. We'll go in a slightly different direction. And if Alex Ross is in the house, I'm stealing a lot of your pictures. We'll talk later. This is one of them. So the title of the talk, and it's an excerpt supplemented with various materials of a chapter from Matters of Gravity, and it's called The Boys in the Hoods, the Costumed Vigilante as Urban Dandy. I find it fascinating, or at least noteworthy, that superheroes, many of whom could, let's face it, live anywhere they want, invariably reside in American cities. Superheroes are homebodies as much as homeboys. Superman is generally content to operate in and around Metropolis. Batman's name is synonymous with Gotham City. And for a strange while, all the Marvel superheroes jostled for room. This isn't a Marvel hero, I'll get to that in a second. Jostled for room and presumably apartments in New York City. Let me propose that American superheroes encapsulated and embodied the same utopian aspirations of modernity as the cities themselves. Superhero narratives thus comprise a genre that joins World's Fairs, urban musicals, and slapstick comedies in presenting urban modernity as a utopia of sublime grace. These comics dream impossible figures in ideal cities, even if those cities themselves were hardly individuated in the first decades of superhero comics. Coast City and Central City were kind of vague names, hardly differentiated backgrounds. More recently, cities have become more particular, and even in the olden times, they were cities. And while superhero comics didn't produce an urban analysis that city planners might be able to use, they nevertheless provide a compelling iconography of a rich urban imaginary, unfettered and uncanny. To the uninitiated, superheroes are uncomplicated figures, authority and order incarnate. Perhaps innately fascist at their core, especially Superman, our homegrown Ubermensch. The superhero is an urban dweller, if you don't think about it much, well, because that's where the criminals are. He operates beyond the strict parameters of the law, the better to enforce its values. He supports the status quo, but remains uncorrupted by the constant corruption he encounters. But I would say that as avatars of law and order and justice and authority go, superheroes are a trivial and unconvincing lot. For the most part, nothing really changes through their actions. The battles leave the real problems of society sporadically acknowledged and hardly addressed. If ideas of preserving order are present at all, it is usually at the level of narrative. The sequence of images, such as we see here, with their candy-colored costumes, dynamic and irregular layouts, movement beyond the boundary of the frame, fragmented temporalities, sound effects, and further abstractions, insist upon a pervasive and very appealing chaos. The hyperbolic spectacle of the color comics page easily undermines, and yes, subverts, those thin fantasies of social order. Superhero comics represent or present something other than or apart from aggressive fantasies of authority and control, something more closely aligned with fantasy and color, but at the same time specific to the urban settings that pervade the genre. And I'm leaving out a whole discussion of the relationship of the superhero to the urban environment, and we'll just concentrate on the way that impacts on costume. Superheroes are all about multiple identities. A few of these pictures are coming up repeatedly today. Superheroes are all about multiple identities, and so they embody the slippery sense of self that living in the city either imposes or permits. Georg Simmel, in his 1903 essay, The Metropolis and Mental Life, set the tone for a pervading ambivalence in his recognition that the quantification of the urban population in terms of productive labor power represented only a very partial accounting of all the men and women in the crowd in the city. The city was a place of aspiration and anonymity, a site of failure and rebirth. It is the function of the metropolis, he wrote, to make a place for the conflict between a definition of the city dweller as an object of economic relations, a worker, and as an autonomous, free, and unique being. In the city, Simmel wrote, the individual's horizon is enlarged. The crowd becomes you, and you wend your way through the crowd. The instrumentalities of individual capitalism define the human with precision, but not with completeness. As a place of being, the city offers room to move. Who reveals this better than the superhero? Whether they're in their true identities as a mild-mannered reporter, a bored millionaire playboy, a crippled paperboy, or a policeman, or incarnated in their more spectacular guises, superheroes play a continuous game of deception and duplicity that could only be played in the city. And I didn't know what to do with this picture, so I thought I'd just put it up here now. I have no comment about it. It just cracks me up. I like Batman just waving, you know. The Dark Knight. Yeah, see ya. Don't forget the milk, you know. Anyway, so whether in their secret identity and their more spectacular guises, superheroes play a continuous game of deception and duplicity that could only be played in the city. And admittedly, none of these characters approach the ambiguity of the shadow of the pulp magazines of the 20s and 30s. His identity as Lamont Cranston was itself only another disguise, perhaps. The city is a haven for imposters. By the early 19th century, physical mobility had made a mockery of social standing. James McCabe observed in 1872 that one cannot mingle much in society here without meeting some mysterious individual who claims to be of noble birth. The city attracted them all: false noblemen, deceptive charity workers, strange and disguised visitors from other planets. Clearly, it's the potential for hubristic comeuppance and nothing else that forces Superman to don a pair of spectacles, comb his hair, and thereby transform himself into Clark Kent, mild-mannered reporter. In later years, this was alluded to in the earlier panel, they tried to convince us that Superman made his face vibrate slightly, which was why nobody really picked up that Clark and Superman were the same person. Yeah, right. We know that Clark's anonymity was a function of a sturdy pair of eyeglasses and mostly the very nature of life in a large city. Perhaps by the 20th century, it no longer mattered who you really were as long as the mask fit. The spirit, the resurrection of the seemingly deceased police detective Denny Colt, dons a small black mask and no one seems the wiser. No one even seems to care. The maintenance of a secret identity depends upon the mask he wears. In Moore's Watchmen, superheroes are generically referred to as masks. The mask is the perfect synecdoche for the superhero, the mysterious totem that makes everything possible. And coincidentally, there's a lecture on masks at the Met today at about 1 o'clock, which has nothing to do with superhero masks. Go no. Perfect synecdoche, the mysterious totem that makes everything possible. And I've created a little montage of them with Spaceman Spiff at the center asking, who is this mysterious masked man? Hope people remember Spaceman Spiff. The iconography of superheroes depends upon costumes and masks. Batman's dark garb, which owes more than a little to such earlier pulp prototypes as the Shadow and the Spider, is atypical in that it is designed for hiding. In general, superhero costumes are a means of putting the body out there, on display. Yeah. And even Batman's costume is designed, as Batman Begins reminds us, to control the theatrics of self-display, the quick change art of surprise entrances and exits. But for the most part, superheroes hide in plain sight. And with the exception of Superman and his semi-libelous cousin Captain Marvel and Wonder Woman are masked women to direct a threat, many female superheroes are not masked. The classic heroes announce their hidden nature through the vehicle of the mask. How indeed does anyone even know that Superman has a secret identity, right? I mean, why would you think that? The mask can be as large as a cowl or a mere hint of a harlequin's diamond pattern, but it was for many years a constant of the genre. In a book on multiple, identities and putting on different selves, Wendy Doniger has written that putting on a mask gets us closer to oneself and farther from another, and so does taking off the mask. And we can therefore infer that superheroes have an innate investment in the infinite regress of self-discovery. That's her term, the infinite regress of self-discovery, but the notion that they are invested in it, and remember where the word investment comes from, it means to dress. To dress up in this sort of, becomes a vehicle of self-discovery. I don't think it's overly generous to claim that the superhero can be seen to embody some fluidity of self, despite a strong counter tendency in most superhero comics towards a kind of muscle-bound stasis. One effect of the mask is to hide the face, and that brings the complex semiotics of facial expression, or that means that the complex semiotics of facial expression really has little function in superhero comics. This must have been a boon to beginning superhero artists who maybe weren't as confident about drawing subtle facial expressions, but the implications are more far-reaching. The expressivity of the face is displaced onto an expressivity of body. Superheroes enact a particularly full-bodied, kinetic performance, very comparable to bodily performance in musical films. Peter Wallen, in his book on Singin' in the Rain, has argued that the virtuosity of the body in the musical preserved the visual expressiveness of the human body in the silent cinema. Without going into it, musical sequences were filmed silently, and the camera could have all the mobility that it used to have in the silent cinema. And the body, which was not relying on speaking at that moment, was expressing itself physically, more along the lines of a silent comedian or silent film performance. A rhetoric of performative gesture had to arise to compensate for the missing voice. The body had to articulate what the verbal could not. Similarly, the superhero, denied the expressivity of the face, must rely on the boldness of bodily presentation. And as these images show, posture, kinesis, and pose structure the theatrics of superheroic performance. I want to talk a little bit more, though, about masks before getting on to costumes. Masks have their place in the history of modernity, and it's a complex one. Mikhail Bakhtin has labeled it the most complex theme of folk culture, but it accrued still more meanings in Western cultures under the Enlightenment and still more meanings within mass culture in the 20th century and now into the 21st. My colleague at Stanford, Terry Castle, has written about the ambiguous philosophical and ethical meanings so prevalent in the way masks appear in narratives of the 18th century. But I wonder if these ambiguities, she confines it to that period, I wonder if we can't find them in more contemporary phenomena. The mask, in her writing, she writes that the mask had found its place within the elegant, decadent recreation of the masquerade, a carefully delineated realm of comparative abandon. It was a party where you put on a mask and no one knew who you were, and all things could happen until identities were reestablished. In the novels of, say, Henry Fielding, things happen under cover of the masquerade. Intrigues, scandals, and a refusal of prevailing social mores were all played through. Castle notes that there's a kind of conflation of different mask functions in these tales. Mikhail Bakhtin and Roger Caillois wrote of an old mask that was associated with shamanistic ritual and medieval carnival that embodied the joy of change and reincarnation, the spiritual and organic union of opposites. So that's one kind of mask, a shamanistic mask that puts one in touch with an animistic spirit of some kind, and which speaks to reincarnation and rebirth. And then there's the mask of modern times, which was no more than a screen, a disguise, or a false front, evoking new and sinister realms of alienation. Castle continues. Instead of working marvelous transformations, the mask now comes to hide something, keeps a secret, deceives. In English, and I'll get back to superheroes in 2 seconds. In English novels of the 18th century, these two ideations of the mask intertwine without resolution. The masquerade permits an uncanny return to an earlier animism. Identity is hidden, but upon this act of disguise, something of the earlier talismanic, shamanistic function of the mask, power of the mask, can again emerge. In Fielding, the masquerade is that charged topos, Castle writes, around which forgotten or subversive possibilities cluster. And I want to propose that the superhero mask, the mask of the modern superhero, is also both a new mask of disguise and an older mask of marvelous transformation. It participates in both traditions. For Bakhtin, the mask could never be another object among objects. It was simply too charged with meanings and functions, whether erotic, magical, or fashionable. In earlier or non-European cultures, masks marked social identity, while the modern use of the mask in the West was intended more to conceal difference and protect identity. Castle points out that only after the emergence of a particular notion of the self as unique, individual, and distinct does the notion of the concealment of identity via the mask take on any social significance. To protect the self in modern times, then, modern man had to don the mask. And if we're not talking about superheroes and normal citizens, they have to join the crowd. Whereas, again, last quote from Castle, whereas the primitive mask expressed an identity to the outside, in fact constructed that identity, the modern mask is a form of protection, a canceling of differences on the outside precisely to make identity possible, or at least an identity that is now individual. Thus, the mask is invisible. For it to function, one cannot be seen to be masked. Otherwise, one is tempted to see what is under that mask. I dwell on these ideas of masking and modernity, and now we're through with that part of the discussion, because it seems to me that superheroes partake of some of the ambiguity that Castle ascribes to 18th century English literature, as well as 20th century urban concerns with anonymity and the mask that cannot be seen, such as Clark Kent's glasses. In their secret identities, superheroes all hide in plain sight. Superman sets the stage, but he also remains somewhat unique. As Jules Feiffer was among the first to observe, while all the other heroes adopted their colorful alter egos later in their life, Superman grew up hiding his true abilities. Superman is disguised as Clark Kent. We've talked about this earlier this morning. Paul Levitz brought this up. While Bruce Wayne disguises himself as Batman. Clark Kent, mild-mannered, blue-suited, earnest, hard-working, dolefully dweeb-like for most of his history, is a perfect embodiment of the masked figure of modern man. One can read a lot into this particular masquerade. Superman's adolescent creators recognizing the repression endemic to the world of adulthood. You grow up, you put on the glasses, you do your job. Midwestern Jewish youngsters fantasizing of being both uniquely superhuman and invisibly assimilated. Quick footnote, it occurred to me recently that the two greatest creations of Midwestern Jews are Superman and Bob Dylan. The next year's paper will be about that. Jewish youngsters fantasizing of being both uniquely superhuman and invisibly assimilated, American everyman as Superman. Meanwhile, Superman is the hero without a mask, his true face revealed to the world, at once monumental and generic. Superman becomes us, goes among us, and we might be him. But Clark is about more than assimilation, and even about more than geek dreams of godhood. This everyman in a dependable suit depends on invisibility, the anonymity permitted by a great metropolis. He cannot be visible, and he has a secret. And so Superman and Clark subvert one another. The man who sees everything with his X-ray vision and telescopic vision meets the man who is not seen. Where's Clark? Wasn't he here a minute ago? But most of the others hide their faces. They can't wait to pull on the tights, don the masks, and streak out into the bright life of the city. Here, masks once again mark a social identity. The costume of the burglar becomes, following Zorro, for example, and the Lone Ranger, a sign of the vigilante hero. Sorry, don't want that up there yet. Let's go back to that for a second. Alex Ross, fantastic piece of work there. Indebted to Berenice Abbott. And here's Alex Toth's version of Zorro. In their first adventures, Superman and Batman battle ordinary, uncostumed foes. Batman's rogues gallery moves decidedly toward the grotesque, with such villains as the Joker and Two-Face, figures who are never permitted the luxury of hiding what they are, although Two-Face is a complicated character, which I don't have time to talk about. But you know, this is a criminal whose face has been scarred by acid, and now this is his permanent visage. Soon, however, with the advent of costumed and masked villains, the mask becomes less a sign of ethical status than a morally indeterminate superness. The costume with a mask marks the individual as being a part of that society that is either superhero or supervillain. Although, as has been pointed out, the superhero is the one with the double identity in most cases. Both masked heroes and villains tapped back into the history of the mask in shamanistic ritual and medieval carnival. In comic books, the mask once more embodied something of the joy of change and reincarnation. Many of these characters are literally or figuratively reborn into their new identities. The fellow in the this is a little montage of characters drawn by Neil Adams. The figure in the center is the Spectre. Jim Stark was the Spectre, a cop gunned down in the line of duty, but he returns as the domino-cloaked Spectre, a figure of unyielding vengeance. The animistic underside to the rational space of the city is exposed in bold, bright colors. And these are also all excellent iterations of the mask. So now I want to turn to the notion of the vigilante and the dandy. Rem Koolhaas, in his book Delirious New York, a book that I cannot recommend highly enough for anyone interested in writing about the city, any city, Rem Koolhaas wrote that the city is a permanent costume party. And if that's true, then superheroes have the best and the brightest costumes. Their outfits are streamlined amalgams of the machinic, the historical, and the organic, but they always emphasize the increasingly exaggerated human musculature beneath. One Alan Moore character, I think in Top 10, which was mentioned earlier, wears no costume. She just adjusts her skin coloring to resemble superhero patterns. And so essentially she's just naked, and when people find that out, they're not comfortable looking at her anymore. But this little joke reminds us that in a lot of ways the superhero body is essentially a nude figure, you know, with some color accessorizing, you know, to demarcate certain areas. Exhibited to a very public gaze. Superheroes are acrobats. Their colorful tights are the garb of circus performers. Dick Grayson, the first Robin, was a circus performer, one of the Flying Graysons. But he was orphaned when gangsters doctored the trapeze ropes with that damn acid that shows up so often in superhero comics. After a little training by Batman, another orphan, cities seem to attract them, he takes on a new role as that astonishing phenomenon, that young Robin Hood of today, Robin the Boy Wonder. Dead Man is a reincarnated circus acrobat out to find out who had him assassinated in mid-performance. But really, they're all circus performers. There are strongmen, Superman, The Thing, aerialists, Batman, here on the right, Daredevil. Clowns, the Joker, acrobats, Nightcrawler, ringmasters, Lex Luthor, the Ringmaster, hypnotists, Mysterio, wild beasts, Catwoman, Wolverine, Hawkman, contortionists, the Elongated Man, Plastic Man, Mr. Fantastic, fire acts, the Human Torch, escape artists, Batman, Mr. Miracle, sideshow freaks, Bizarro, the Geek, the X-Men, magicians, Mandrake, Doctor Strange, sharpshooters, Green Arrow, half men, half beasts like Hulk and Swamp Thing, and a Sacco finish. One character was named the Human Bomb. I have no idea what his second adventure was like. In her book, Sex and Suits, Anne Hollander describes several shifts in the history of civilized attire. At some point, dress began to mark differences of gender and not simply of class. And the neoclassic moment put a final seal of disapproval on gaudy clothes for serious men. While the man's suit was a dynamic yet subtle manifestation of bodily power, flexible and flowing, closely shaped to torso and mobile limbs, men's clothing turned away from flamboyant color and excess. The superhero costume, quite clearly, marks a return to earlier modes of male self-presentation by combining Rococo ornamentation in its flashing colors, flowing capes, epaulets, and talismans, with a classical idea in which the hero wore nothing but his perfect nudity, perhaps enhanced by a short cape falling behind him. I'm quoting from Anne Hollander here. The nude costume, she writes, was the one most suggestive of perfect male strength, perfect virtue, and perfect honesty, with overtones of independence and rationality. The hero's harmonious nude beauty was the visible expression of his uncorrupted moral and mental qualities. So this goes back to what Peter introduced in his talk this morning. The costume signifies various things, but it signifies it very often without hiding, without interfering with what the nude body represents beneath it all. Purity and performative flamboyance were thus uniquely combined in the superhero's costume. And if Batman eschewed color to embody instead his heart of darkness, Robin the Boy Wonder was right by his side, accoutred in red tunic, yellow cape, and green booties. We talked about some theories of that this morning. Another theory was that Robin made an awfully good target. You know, draw fire. Anyway, that's one way of looking at it. The appeal of classical purity speaks for itself, but flamboyance is the real issue here. Alongside the image of an idealized classical self, superheroes further embody a male fantasy of flamboyant, performative intemperance. This is the original Green Lantern, early comic book covers from the 40s on the left, and updated images of the same character by Alex Ross on the right. And I like this character because he seems to have so much of the swashbuckler in his costume, the connection to pirates and dressing up, and the male adventure all seems to be contained there, plus, you know, a color scheme that Errol Flynn would never have been caught dead in. But anyway. They further embody a male fantasy of flamboyant, performative intemperance, something blocked by the pragmatic, self-controlled economy of an historically constructed masculine cultural identity. And that masculine cultural identity was signified by the visual drabness of the clothes in that man's closet. But many of those closets in superhero stories have secret doors opening onto a broader sense of what is appropriate to the body or man, to the boy or the man, to the body of the male figure. Our costume vigilante is perhaps something more of a dandy, a flamboyantly powered urban male who, if not for his never-ending battle for truth, justice, and the American way, would probably be ordered to just move it along, and clear the sidewalk. And here I just have some images. Here's somebody in I think it's from a film version of The Scarlet Pimpernel, I'm not exactly sure, with our bohemian Dr. Strange who lives in Greenwich Village. And I think we can see the foppishness of their garb. Here too, a couple of images I've pulled off, both contemporary and historical. An 1818 caricature by George Cruikshank featuring men squeezing themselves into the latest, most dandified fashions, and of course mocking them for doing so. Beau Brummel, one of the men who was responsible for the tailored suit, but who also was a notorious dandy on the right-hand side there. And on the left, we have Jim Kent as the Scarlet Pimpernel, a swashbuckling hero who dressed as something of a dandy, but the Scarlet Pimpernel was an organization that was helping fight the good fight behind the scenes and underground. So an early manifestation of the superhero and a very early place of overlap between the dandy and the vigilante. What battles against crime and corruption really do, it seems, is license the donning of the superhero garb, legitimate the movement out of the home, through the window, and into the secret magic of the urban night. The fantasy, then, is one of dressing up. Superheroes don't wear costumes in order to fight crime. They fight crime so that they can wear the costumes. Thank you, that's the big line. And at this point, just a footnote again to Grant Morrison's recent work in which the characters in the worlds that he creates are superhero fetish freaks, who really they're jealous of mutants. They get body parts soldered onto themselves so they can be mutants. There are websites where, women are just posing in superhero costumes. I mean, it all makes perfect sense. So they fight crime in order to wear the costumes. Now, here it seems that I might be edging up on a very typical reading of superheroes and their costumes, a homoerotic reading of buff closet queens, escaping the mundane world to mingle in secret places with their even more flamboyantly subversive enemies, allies, doppelgangers. But that's been done. And it's not entirely wrong, but it's also not good enough. I'd like to soften that reading a bit and spin it somewhat differently by suggesting that the superhero raids several closets before swinging out on the town, indulging in the flamboyance of urban fashion, desiring to perform anonymously but in full view, fantasizing of a presentness usually assigned to ethnic others, which I'll discuss in a minute. The superhero heads for marginalized sites of non-production or spectacular destruction, not to impose order, but to participate in, to belong to the chaos. Perhaps the concern with law and order. Let me pause here for a minute. I want to run through some images for you. I pulled some definitions of the dandy off dandyism.net and found some images to go along with them. And it's a bit edited, and I just thought it would be fun to do. Some of the people being cited here are well known, others less so. But anyway, the physical characteristics of the dandy, not all of which are physical or about fashion. To appear well-dressed, to be skinny and tall, well, I thought this little Will Eisner spirit kind of did the job. Elegant. We talked about the aerodynamic costume of Green Lantern earlier. The dandy's independence, assurance, originality, self-control, and refinement should be visible in the cut of his clothes. And again, no cape, everything streamlined, everything functional. Free from folly or affectation. Self-mastery. Manage yourself well, and you may manage all the world. And Baudelaire says that should a dandy suffer pain, he will keep smiling. And there we see Superman saying, it tickles. Aplomb, Plastic Man again. Really, it's about how you do it. It's about having a sense of style. And if this does not reveal a sense of style, I don't know what does. Independence makes the dandy. Ideally financial independence, and there up top is Bruce Wayne saying, Dad's estate left me wealthy. I am ready, but first I must have a disguise. And then the independence will also be expressed through his work, often to the point of aloofness, also characterizes the dandy's dealings with the world. The epitome of selfish irresponsibility, he was ideally free of all human commitments. Wit. A paradoxical way of talking lightly of the serious and seriously of the light that carries philosophical implications. And here we see Spider-Man hanging J. Jonah Jameson up with his web and saying, I figured you need a new outlook on life, so I thought I'd give you one. All right, it's not the wittiest thing. It's not Oscar Wilde, I'll give you that, but it's best I could do on short notice. A skeptical, world-weary, sophisticated, bored, or blasé demeanor. And here we have the Thing riding some sort of Kirby-designed gizmo that he seems utterly uninterested in because he would rather be home watching the Mets. So this kind of blasé attitude towards the cosmic occurrences that are the norm in these people's lives is a part of what they do. A self-mocking and ultimately endearing egotism. Once again, it seems to me the Thing sort of saying, you know, I can't read it from here, but it's no good being a hero if there ain't anyone around to see you. And then at the end says, hey, you really did it, man. He goes, well, naturally. What do you think? I was a pantywaist? So a kind of endearing and self-mocking egotism. And then as part of that, the notion that the dandy really does not commune well with normal people. And so I pulled out a couple of images that sort of represent this kind of thing. One by Alex Ross, and this a portrait of like some superhero reunion gathering by the magazine illustrator Seth. Dignity and reserve, and here we have, you know, the Silver Surfer saying that emotions are for lesser men and he will bear whatever he must. And a Renaissance man, a complete gentleman who, according to somebody there, ought to dress well, dance well, fence well. And at top we have Bruce Wayne, at the bottom we have Batman, the same man, comfortable in both worlds. Here we have, we'll get back to that in a second, a picture of the dandy/performance artist Sebastian Horsley on the left. He's on the left. And a recent cover of a Green Lantern magazine by Howard Chaykin on the right, both of them expressing, I think, a very similar attitude towards the normal people that are looking. But we'll get back to that in a second. Perhaps the concern with law and order should be reconstrued to remove it from narrow legalistic definition. After all, the laws of physics and biology are more inverted than affirmed in these free-flying figures. And what role can order serve with regard to flamboyant contents of the superhero's closet? So law and order, you know, might be defined in different ways. Baudelaire referred to dandyism as an institution beyond the laws. And despite its association with effeminacy, Sartre found it more exhibitionistic than homosexual at its core. And that's why this image resonates so strongly with me. Dandies operate on their own authority and with the help of wit, which is an acid, and of grace, which is a dissolvent. They manage to ensure the acceptance of their changeable rules, though these are in fact nothing but the outcome of their own audacious personalities. While superheroes, especially those that wisecrack whilst in the very midst of battle, seem more witless than witty, their universe is a kind of self-referential and solipsistic realm centered upon an audacious performance by a flamboyant figure who is permitted to slip the bonds of conventional behavior and being. In Superman, the transcendent imperatives of the Übermensch are tempered by the dandy's unseriousness. The transcendent imperatives of the Übermensch are tempered by the dandy's unseriousness. Baudelaire connected, got a couple of pages left. Baudelaire connected the dandy to the modern urban landscape. Although his analysis of a more self-alienated observer, the flaneur, has received more attention of late than the seemingly blasé but relentlessly committed performance of the dandy. And I'll skip a couple of quotes here that talk about the way the dandy takes the flaneur much further. Jules Amédée Barbé d'Aurevilliers, I'm sorry, I'm not good at this, noted that Beau Brummel had an air of elegant indifference which he wore like armor and which made him invulnerable. Or, Barbé quickly adds, which made him appear invulnerable. And if I hadn't read Superman growing up, I don't know if I'd even know the word invulnerable. The costume is the sign and source of power, and it's the mark of grace. Norman Mailer's essay, The White Negro, tries to co-opt some of the dandy's projected grace for another user. In Mailer's mythos, the white Negro, or hipster, is a kind of racial cross-dresser, performing the perceived existential freedom of the urban black male. Rendered powerless in American society, the black man, Mailer writes, lived in the enormous present. He subsisted for his Saturday night kicks, relinquishing the pleasures of the mind for the more obligatory powers of the body. The hipster partakes of this acceptance of death and danger, living as he is in the shadow of the bomb and the Holocaust. His isolation is willed. Norman Mailer calls it the isolated courage of isolated people, which would make a fine superhero credo. Superheroes could be seen as an inchoate version of the same thing. Their sagas are passing narratives. Superman's Midwestern Jewish co-creators cloaking themselves not only in the power of Superman, but in the metropolitan anonymity of Clark Kent. And in their multicolored, flamboyant absurdity, the superhero is also a kind of hipster, seeking to swoop down and possess the life of the street. The costume still serves as a mark of difference, but now the superhero, and this is like where my reading has been pointing, the costume serves as a mark of difference, but now the superhero signals an abdication of responsibility rather than serving as its supposedly most exemplary figure. So on some level, this is blacking up. Putting on the mask permits an extroversion only while cloaked in the guise of someone else. And that's exactly Mailer's critique of the hipster. And as Rhonda Garelick argues in her book on dandyism, all dandyism hints at a wish for male autochthony. Autochthony, being birthed from the ground. In other words, a male birth that has nothing to do with women. This unisexual generation. For the dandy, or not for the dandy, but within this worldview, the woman disturbs the dandies and maybe the superheroes' perfect aesthetic self-containment and self-generation. The self in motion is in some ways kind of an immobilized, unchanging self. Now these points are valid and important, but in some ways they're a little bit too damning. The dandy, what we need to remember here is that according to Barbet, the dandy combines frivolity on the one hand, acting upon a people rigid and coarsely utilitarian, and on the other hand, imagination, claiming its rights in the face of a moral law too severe to be genuine, producing a kind of translation, a science of manners and attitudes impossible elsewhere. Fantasy is, after all, the place for the abdication of responsibility, a place of temporary grace, a celebration of implausibility. That, to me, is at the heart of what the superhero is when he's working. I'm going to skip the last page and just go to my conclusion. I was going to talk a little bit about the connection to Nietzsche, not through his evocation of the often misunderstood notion of the Übermensch and the way that that links up to superheroes, because that is neither here nor there. What does appeal to me in Nietzsche is his evocation of a kind of the need for what he calls a gay science, a lightness of spirit. He writes, I would believe only in a God who could dance, and when I saw my devil, I found him serious, thorough, profound, and solemn. It was the spirit of gravity. Through him all things fall. I just want to rack something up here in preparation. Not by wrath does one kill, but by laughter. Come, let us kill the spirit of gravity. I have learned to walk ever since I have let myself run. I have learned to fly ever since I do not want to be pushed before moving along. Now I am light, now I fly, now I see myself beneath myself, now a god dances through me. Thus, the plumage of the dandy is quite in keeping with the playful aspects of Nietzsche's thought and language. Although not, I don't think Nietzsche's aestheticism would find a favorable, purchase with, the dandies would find that a really tedious bore. The superhero does have affinities with Nietzsche's Overman, but not in that sense of transcendence that gives the hero powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men, nor in the movement of the hero beyond good and evil, but rather through a basically light, playful, and performative dance, a dance that is signaled and prefigured by the visual flamboyance of their highly decorative plumage. The superhero, then, counterintuitively perhaps, can be our ally against the spirit of gravity. In rising brightly over our heads, he compels us to look, and look again, and then to exclaim, "Look, up in the sky." Thank you.